Welcome back in the time of knights, counts, and castles. We are at the Gravensteen of Ghent, which means the Count's Rock, and is the only of the three medieval forts of Ghent that still stands today. It is also the only remaining medieval castle in Flanders with an almost intact defense system. But are these statements correct? And what has that to do with the castle's biggest secret? Follow us and learn all there is to know from this fascinating castle. Its history begins around 870, when Count Baldwin had a fortification built at the branch of the Lea River to protect local citizens from Viking raids. Many northern European cities along rivers were attacked by Vikings from the water at that time and built similar forts, such as the Berkers and Leiden in the Netherlands. Around the year 937, Baldwin's grandson, Arnulf the Great, probably had the first real wooden predecessor of the Gravensteen built, and the castle became a central place in the region, with leather workers, grain storage, and perhaps even a chapel. On the hill, also called a motte, Count Baldwin, the fourth or fifth, had the first stone residential tower, or donjon, built about 100 years later. But when the wooden parts of this castle burned down in a city fire in 1176, his great-grandson, Philip of Alzace, had a completely new stone castle built after he returned from a crusade in 1178 in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, present-day Palestine. He had Gravensteen rebuilt in the style of the castles that the Crusaders built in the East as impregnable fortresses around Jerusalem, of which the best-known example is the Crac des Chevaliers in Syria. This architectural style was unknown in Northern Europe, and being able to build such a castle underlined the power and wealth of Philip, whose coat of arms is still borne by Flanders. This is the castle that still exists today, so follow us, and let us take you into the stories that took place in the ruins of this 12th century castle. We start our tour at the gatehouse. The thousands of tourists who enter here every day have no idea that until the 16th century at this spot, those sentenced to death were beheaded here in front of the Count, often after they had first been taken in hand by the executioner. The doors hold an equally gruesome story, as the fists of anyone who dared to attack a Count's officer were cut off and hung on the gate here as a deterrent. And until 1830, paws of dangerous animals like wolves and foxes that had been killed were also hung on these doors as trophies. Nowadays, the building on your right when you enter houses the ticket office, but once it housed the horse stables, and later also a feared torture chamber. Once through the gate, we enter the courtyard and go right to arrive in the basement of the main building. Here, in the far left corner under the gravel, wooden remains of Arnulf the Great's first castle from the 9th century have been found. And the walls surrounding us once were the base of the first stone residential tower from the 11th century, where Count Baldwin the fifth lived with his wife. The holes on both sides once contained solid wooden beams that supported the wooden planks of a first floor, and in the right-hand corner on both floors we find recesses that were probably dungeons. We return to the square and climb the stairs to the left to enter the hall. The tourists nowadays quickly slip in and out to get an audio guide, but once this was the most important room of the castle. The donjon was raised to 30 meters during the rebuilding in 1180 by Philip of Alzace, because the increasingly wealthy Ghent merchants began to build higher houses than his castle. Of course, the Count could not allow this to happen, and when the renovation was completed around 1191, the citizens looked up to him again when he looked out over the city from his tower, which probably also had a balcony. Large parties were held in the donjon, and at the back we can find a huge fireplace that still is authentic, and a direct connection to the central kitchen, which is now dilapidated, as we can see on the outside. From the time of the Count until the 16th century during Ghent neighborhood festivals, the most delicious meats were prepared here, which the abbot of the St. Peter's Abbey, as a vassal, was obliged to supply. We walk up to the first floor, past the foreroom which is now known as the Roman hallway, and arrive in a second hall that has now been beautifully restored. The armor and weapons on display here will have been used very little, as the era of knights already came to an end around the 15th century, but beautiful damsels or countesses may have sat in these original niches by the windows for a long time afterwards. We climb further to the roof of the keep, from where we have a magnificent view over the city, and Philip must have looked down with pride on his subjects. What many people don't know is that the donjon's entire roof was destroyed after a fire around the year 1400, and until its restoration in the early 20th century, this roof didn't exist. We descend again and enter the living quarters of the Count and Countess on the first floor via a covered walkway. You might think that they lived in the largest tower, but such rooms were far too large to heat in the Middle Ages, so the Count and Countess sought warmth around their fireplace in this much smaller living room. Counts used the castle only for a short period, because as of 1407, Gravenssteen's main hall served for centuries as a courtroom of the Council of Flanders, and it became the center of punishment in Flanders. Until 1442, the registry of the Council of Flanders was located in the former living room of the Counts, and all judicial decisions were safely stored in this room. As we descend, we enter the prestigious reception room where the Count's guests waited for him, but it's even more fascinating to realize you are now in the room where the Council of Flanders pronounced their many death sentences. And in the times Belgium was part of the Netherlands, it was here that peace treaties such as the Peace of Münster and the 12 Years' Truce were proclaimed to the citizens. The damage you see to the pillars in the middle of the room conceals a previously unmentioned history, because this happened when this room of the castle was used as engine room of a cotton mill. But before we tell that story, we walk outside and via the rampart, we go to the oldest and most original, but also perhaps most gruesome medieval place of the castle. On the floor above the castle entrance, we find a square room in which the infamous neck clamp, a torture device, can still be found, and behind it, the elongated room that was probably originally the chapel of the castle. But if it once was a church, it was a special one, because in the two extreme corners we find throwing holes, through which stones and boiling oil could be thrown to defend the entrance of the castle. Until the 18th century, this room was nicknamed the Sugar Drawer because a mute with the same name stood here. A mute is a metal cage that, like a modern isolation cell, was used to punish prisoners who misbehaved. We quickly go outside for some fresh air and walk around the main building, studying the ramparts, which also date back to 1180, and displays the modern defensive techniques the architect had learned in the Middle East and copied from the Knights Hospitallers' castles. The wall contains a total of 24 oriel turrets with loopholes for archers, which consisted of 2 stories so that the soldiers could easily resist attackers from loopholes in the towers high above the ground. The wooden shutters provided protection for soldiers firing from the battlements and could be tilted up to allow larger objects such as stones to be thrown down. However, as mentioned, the Middle Ages would not last much longer once the castle was completed, and the wall has actually always been primarily decorative and status-enhancing rather than military. After centuries of serving various functions as a courthouse and prison, economic decline in the 19th century left the castle's future hanging by a thread. After the Council of Flanders left for good in 1778, a cotton mill was established in the abandoned keep in 1807, and when the factory left the castle in 1887, it left nothing less than a ruin, as can be seen on this drawing. This photogram from 1890 shows that the drawing is not exaggerated, and there was serious talk of razing the symbol of torture and feudal oppression to the ground once and for all. But after the municipality bought back the site in 1893, it was decided that architect Joseph de Well could start a large-scale restoration of the site in 1894. All historical sources, such as this drawing in the Flandria Lustrida from 1641, or this painting of a son who had to behead his father as punishment with the Count's stone in the background, were meticulously studied, and much of the original Tournai stones from the rubble around the towers were used. It can also be seen from the 17th century, drawing up to the first photographs at the end of the 19th century, that the wall was hidden for a long time behind a row of workers' houses, which were removed again during the restoration. Architect Joseph de Well, and after his death, his colleague Stéphane Mortier, delivered magnificent work, and the World Exhibition in Ghent in 1913 ensured that the completely restored Gravensteen became world famous. However, with the enormous growth of historical and scientific knowledge since the 1980s, it has become increasingly apparent that many details, such as the Roman gallery and the battlements of the keep, are not historically correct. So the biggest secret of the Gravensteen is that once you know it, you can clearly see that large parts of the castle are actually an early 20th century reproduction, rather than a medieval building. Since then, restorations like this have been controversial among archaeologists, and the question arises whether we are looking at a fake castle or a medieval treasure. But despite everything, it remains clear that a visit to the castle is a particularly educational experience that is highly recommended. Thanks for watching, and we love to hear in the comments whether or not you think Gravensteen is a fake castle.